My name is Bruce Iglauer, and I'm the president and founder of Alligator Records. Alligator is based in Chicago, but it's become the largest record company in the world for recording blues and roots music. I didn't grow up in Chicago. I discovered the blues when I was in college in Wisconsin, and I started coming to Chicago to hear blues in its natural environment. I read about a man named Bob Kester who ran a record store named the Jazz Record Mart and a label called Delmark Records that recorded blues and jazz. When I first came to Chicago in 1968, the only thing I knew about how to find blues, how to find live blues, was find this man named Bob Kester. So I went to the Jazz Record Mart at 7 West Grand. It was perhaps the seediest record store I've ever been in. Paint was peeling from the walls. There was dust everywhere. There were these old beat up bins of LPs on tabletops. And behind the cash register was a very charismatic, outspoken, talked all the time, seemed to know everything about blues and jazz man named Bob Kester. He had started Delmark Records in the mid-1950s in a dorm room in his college in St. Louis and migrated to Chicago in 1959 and opened a record store there. His label existed in the basement, which was even seedier than the rest of the store. I was fascinated by this man, and he took me out to hear blues, just as I was told he would. He took me to Teresa's Lounge at 48th and Indiana. He took me to the Blue Flame at 39th and Drexel. I think he took me to Pepper's Lounge at 43rd and Vincennes. Now, in 1968 and 69, in fact, until the early 70s, the only place you could hear blues in Chicago was on the south side or the west side, in the black neighborhoods. There had been a moment in the mid-60s when the blues was getting played a little bit around the Rush Street and Wells Street nightclub scenes, where the Paul Butterfield Band and the Siegel Schwall Band and to some extent Charlie Musselwhite got their careers started. But that had disappeared by the time I moved to Chicago, which was the beginning of 1970. On a Saturday night on the south side or the west side, there were probably a total of 40 clubs where you could hear blues bands ranging from Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters to obscure people like Left Hand Frank. Often for $1, sometimes for 50 cents at the door, sometimes free. Most of these were neighborhood taverns with no sign in the window saying there was music, with no advertising, with no mention in the daily newspapers or on the radio. It was as though they didn't exist in mainstream media. And yet I could go on Friday or Saturday night and see Otis Rush, and I could see Jimmy Dawkins and Mighty Joe Young and Junior Wells and Buddy Guy for 50 cents or $1 in these wonderful clubs full of people who had grown up in the South and grown up with the music of these musicians, listened to it their whole lives. When I moved to Chicago at the beginning of 1970 and went to work for Delmark Records in the seedy basement of the Jazz Record Mart, the blues scene here was booming, but it was entirely in the ghetto, in the black community. Virtually all those clubs that I visited, dozens and dozens of clubs, are gone. Some of them are vacant lots, some of them are boarded up buildings, some of them have new construction. Pepper's Lounge is now a building that holds a health clinic, for example. There are government buildings where the 1815 Club used to be on Roosevelt Road. There are vacant lots where the Checkerboard, Buddy Guy's Club was. Teresa's is the only building that still exists, even though there's not a club there. All of that scene is gone. But it was wonderful at the time. It was a neighborhood scene. It was people who had grown up together. It was people who had grown up in the same little towns in the South and had come north to Chicago looking for jobs and had labor jobs or sometimes no jobs. And they were hearing musicians who were of exactly the same culture, who were their friends and neighbors. Buddy Guy was a tow truck driver. Most of the musicians had day jobs. They couldn't exist just playing music. In January of 1970, I ran into Hound Dog Taylor at Teresa's Lounge, and he told me he had a Sunday afternoon gig at a club called Florence's at 54th Place in Shields. Now, I had seen Hound Dog sitting in, and it was kind of a disaster. And musicians couldn't follow him. I frankly didn't think he was very good, but I was intrigued by a Sunday afternoon gig. It was the only gig I knew with the blues band on Sunday afternoon. So I went down there in January of 1970 and walked into Florence's Lounge, a neighborhood tavern, and saw Hound Dog Taylor and his own band, the House Rockers, just a second guitar, Brewer Phillips, and a drummer named Ted Harvey, making the happiest music I ever heard in my life. It was so infectious, it was so rhythmic, it was so much fun. Even I could dance to it. And people were dancing in the aisles and in front of the band. There was no bandstand in front of the folding chairs the band was sitting on. And I fell in love with the band. I went back to my boss, Bob Kester, and said, "You've got to record this band." And I couldn't talk him into it. And so in 1971, I scraped up $2,500 and went into the studio to record my favorite band, Hound Dog Taylor and the House Rockers. And that was the beginning of my label. 44 years later, I'm still recording my favorite bands. Working for Bob Kester, I had had a chance to go into the studio a few times on sessions that he was producing. The week after I arrived in Chicago, January 8th, 1970 to be specific, I was in the studio with Junior Wells, Buddy Guy, Louis Myers, Otis Spann, Fred Bielo, and Ernest Johnson, working on a record, being the gopher on a record called Junior Wells Southside Blues Jam. Every one of these men was a world-class blues musician. So I felt like I had just moved from Wisconsin to heaven. While I worked for Bob, I was at sessions with Jimmy Dawkins, with Carrie Bell, with Robert Lockwood Jr., with Roosevelt Sykes, and I watched Bob work in the studio. So I had some sense of how things were done in the studio. Technically, I knew nothing. I had to rely on experienced engineers. I used the studio Bob liked best, and the engineer, Stu Black, had worked at Chess Records, so he had recorded Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters. He knew what blues was supposed to sound like. When I went into the studio with Hound Dog Taylor, those three guys, we just set them up just like they were in the club, just right next to each other. We had a little bit of some baffles around the drums so they wouldn't leak into the other mics as much. And we recorded everything totally live. There was no fixing, there were no overdubs. We just did every song a couple times and went on to the next one. And a few friends came so they could be an audience because Hound Dog played better when he had somebody to play for. So I made that first record in about 8 hours in 2 evenings. And I think we've sold probably 130, 140,000 copies of that record. It made my label. And I went on to do 3 other records with Hound Dog, and then I've issued every outtake and live performance I could get my hands on. At the time I started Alligator, I was still an employee of Delmark Records. I released my first record in the fall of '71, and Bob actually would let me come in and pack my boxes and ship them at the same time I shipped the Delmark product that I was shipping, the Delmark LPs, because that's what we were making. In the spring of '72, I was so involved with Hound Dog Taylor's career. I was getting ready to release a Big Walter Horton record, and Bob Kester sat me down and said, "It's time for you to make a decision. Do you work for me or do you work for yourself?" And frankly, I was amazed that he had given me the months that he had when I was actually competing with him to stay under his roof and work for him and learn more from him. But at that time, I had to thank him and leave, and I've been out on my own ever since. When Alligator started, I could afford to make 1 record a year. Each record had to pay for the next one. So in the beginning, I had Hound Dog Taylor, and then Big Walter Horton, then a completely unknown musician named Sun Seals, and then I was so desperate that my company was going to fold. I did a second record with Hound Dog Taylor because he was the artist who was selling. Then Fenton Robinson, then Coco Taylor, and shortly after that, I recorded my first musician who wasn't from Chicago, Albert Collins, who was from Texas and living on the West Coast. But I brought him to Chicago to record here with Chicago musicians who ended up becoming his road band, the Icebreakers. I started making 2 and 3 records a year and eventually recorded artists like Johnny Winter and Roy Buchanan and Lonnie Mack. I recorded the Grammy-winning album Showdown with Robert Cray and Johnny Copeland, along with Albert Collins. I went on to record artists as diverse as Corey Harris and Michael Hill and Marcia Ball and Tommy Castro and Anders Osborne. There are almost 300 albums on Alligator now. We're still releasing anywhere from 5 to 10 albums a year, and still signing new artists. Most recently, we've signed 2 young artists from the South, Jerika Singleton from Mississippi and Selwyn Birchwood from Florida. And our most recent signing is a Chicago musician named Toronzo Cannon, who's been developing and becoming better and better for years in the local club scene, and remains working as a Chicago bus driver. These days, the fan base for blues, unlike when I came to Chicago, is mostly white people. There are still black blues fans, but they tend to like a sort of more soul music infused style of blues that's generally called Southern soul. And those Southern soul artists play at big places like the Holiday Star Theater in Merrillville, Indiana, not so much in clubs. The club scene is now almost entirely for white audiences. And the clubs that I go to are well-known clubs, Buddy Guy's Legends downtown, Blues on Halstead and Kingston Mines directly across the street from each other in the Lincoln Park area. I go occasionally to Blues Chicago, which is in the River North area. And then 2 good suburban clubs, Space in Evanston, Illinois, which books a lot of different kinds of music, including blues, and a wonderful club called Fitzgerald's in Berwyn, Illinois, which books all American roots music, including blues and Americana, and some funkier country music, and some bluegrass, and even a little jazz and singer-songwriter. And I consider one of the best booked music clubs in the country. Not necessarily just a blues club, but just a great club, a club that roots music people should come from all over the world to go to. I don't go out as many nights as I used to. Part of the reason is that there's a group of Chicago musicians who are sort of in rotation in the clubs. So I've seen most of the great surviving Chicago bluesmen and women a number of times. But I'll still go out 1 or 2 nights a week, or I'll be in rehearsal with a band that I'm producing one night a week. I love live music. There is nothing like live music. I make records, and I will tell you the most satisfying thing you can do to your music is go be in the presence of a live band, especially one that is coming onto stage without a set list, with a repertoire of songs, and they're choosing the songs to fit the feel that they're getting from the audience and the feel they're getting from themselves, so that they might do any one of 100 songs they know, depending on whether the audience is feeling the slow ones or the fast ones, whether people want to dance, whether people want to be more traditional or more contemporary, or what the artist is feeling, whether the artist is feeling happy or sad, how the band is interacting, what feels right at that moment. Going to see big productions at big theaters and stadiums where every move is choreographed doesn't interest me at all. All of that's showbiz. Going to see a blues club in a bar, that's a real music experience. Chicago still has, as it did in 1970 when I moved here, still has the most active blues scene of any city in the country. There are literally some hundreds, not hundreds and hundreds, but some hundreds of people who are reasonably professional blues musicians who will go play in a club for money. The bands are often put together for the gig. So you'll see one drummer, in 3 different bands, or one bass player playing with somebody else one night instead of the person you saw him with the night before. People jam all the time. And there are opportunities for young musicians to sit in and get heard and go to Blue Monday jam sessions or Thursday night jam sessions and get a chance to be on stage and hone their music in front of a live audience. So if you're a blues fan, Chicago is still the best place in the world to live.